Canada-China conflict. What happened? How did we get here? What's the exit? I wouldn't say that Canada and China have a disagreement. We're in an actual crisis bilaterally. We're not speaking meaningfully at any official or any serious high level. We've forgotten how to speak. There seems to be little to speak about. And dare I say, from the professional class, it seems unattractive to travel to China, which is the biggest tragedy. I love traveling to China. I love the Chinese. I love China. And for all my young students and my colleagues who've not been and spent time there, I say, here's student law number 5.3. You must spend a professional year studying, learning in China in your 20s or 30s. It is the future. It's not a morality play. It just is the future. How do I know it's thus? Well, I would say that Canada has never really known China in its modern form in any way. Canada is created in 1867. By that time, China, a different state though, Imperial China, has already lost the Second Opium War. It's destabilized for about 150 years. Now it's back with a vengeance, strategically, economically, psychologically, administratively, culturally. Yeah. It is a very serious, huge entity. I need not speak just about the demographics. As a machine, it's very serious. We've never known it thus, and indeed the 150 years of Chinese destabilization after the Opium Wars, all the chaos that happened, mostly internally, coincides exactly with the period of Canadian Confederation. We're 152, 153 years old. The Chinese are restabilized after that period. So we're just getting to know one another. And what happens just as we're starting to get to know one another? We butt heads. À notre insu. We butt heads and we kill the relationship before we even got started. How could this happen? Now let me just start bluntly again. I'm of the view that Canada, unless we're at war, should never be an enemy of China. It is a nonsense strategically. It is nonsense even morally. What are we talking about? China is a country of 1.5 billion people. We're 37 million. We have different traditions, different governing systems, different destinies, different geographies. Unless they're attacking us, we ought to reckon with this huge country in all its dimensions, not reduce it to a single morality play, a single persona, or a single transaction. Well, can we do that? It's not obvious. Canada does not have a big history of reckoning at its borders with countries that are other than us culturally. Here's our 4-point game. Let's go back to that famous framework with which we started. ACRE. America, Europe, China, Russia. ACRE. We started from the European proposition, the modern landing. By the time we had Confederation, we were comfortable with essentially the A and E gravity. This was our essential imagination, the A and E axis. This is where we are today, and indeed more at the A axis. That's where we live not only physically, but psychologically. But here we have two new borders this century. We've got Russia across the Arctic, an objective neighbor on the other side. We don't have to be a fan of their system of government. We don't have to like them culturally, linguistically. That's irrelevant. They're an objective neighbor. We have to reckon with them. And I say, let us not presume that they're enemies automatically. Let's figure out, first of all, who they are. We have no clue. It's even worse on China because the culture is even more foreign, the language less accessible, and the proximity to us less obvious for 99% of top Canadian decision makers in the private and public sector alike. China is very close to us. Yukon is closer to Beijing, as I mentioned, than Sydney is. Same with Prince Rupert. So we are close to the Chinese. They're on our western border. ACRE. Now, if we live only along the American axis, our comfortable axis, then we're missing the entire boat. And indeed, that's what happened when we started negotiating the USMCA agreement with the Americans and the Mexicans. How did we come to make an enemy of China? 2 points. Trump came to power and first of all declared, at least in his mind, if not publicly, that China was the #1 target of his ire. For reasons of trade, for reasons of currency, whatever caprice was on his mind on the day, China was the persona non grata in the American theater. They were the other. Thereafter started an information war from the American system, and they have other huge platforms that started a morality play of us against them, and we Canadians not having our own platforms are enough weight to think for ourselves. That's a different micro lecture we'll get to later, the idea of thinking for ourselves through our own platforms and our own reflections. We're not able to resist. We became overrun with this euphoria about China being the worst thing since since the last bad thing, whatever that was. China hadn't changed that much in the period between Obama and Trump as to merit this, in my view. It's been on a pretty consistent pattern, and again, it cannot be reduced to a single evil or indeed a single good. I'm not doing a hagiography, nor am I doing a parody of the good and evil. That was the first point. But fatally for us in Canada, the real genesis of the conflict with China was that we negotiated an article, or we allowed an article to be included in the USMCA agreement to which we attached our signature, that stated that Canada could not effectively negotiate a free trade agreement with China without the say-so of the Mexicans and the Americans. Read the Americans. The language was non-market country. Of course, they meant China. There are other countries that could be non-market. Non-market, not on the WTO understanding, on the American understanding. The Americans essentially, and good on them, through their genius, imposed on us a clause that said we could not have full-on economic relations. Full-on being the culmination of all economic relations being a free trade agreement, more or less. Canada could not go so far without the say-so formally of the Americans. We signed that into law. We didn't ratify it, but we signed it into an international agreement. From the Chinese perspective, they were saying, what? You were just talking to us about free trade. Very well, the negotiations weren't going well. And maybe they'll never go well. But when you have a negotiation on one hand about free trade, and on the other hand you allow the stated enemy, the new enemy of China, to impose on you a clause that forbids you from achieving this culmination of economic relations without the approval, without the approbation of Washington. Now, what is that? The Chinese thought themselves either betrayed or shocked or confused. And I understand their position, and I didn't understand our position. Because it was never stated publicly. It's never been defended. Indeed, it's not on any government websites. It's lost in the morass of clauses, and it's central to our current troubles in Canada. Because we made an enemy of China through one clause imposed by another capital, against our own geographic interests, our own destiny, our own thinking for ourselves. We allowed Washington on their own mental map. Washington has its own mental map, and they know where China is. We don't. We allowed them to impose their structure on us without resisting, without reflecting, because we were on this gravity. Whereas we should have been understanding this relationship, the CA, forgive me. And in not doing that, we've cut off the sea for the foreseeable future. Indeed, it's worse than that, because we appear to have signed under great pressure. Maybe we didn't sign that particular clause under pressure, but we signed the overall agreement under great pressure. Trump imposed significant steel and aluminum tariffs on us and threatened to impose other tariffs, namely on the automobile sector. Under that pressure, we at least appear to have attached our signature to this treaty. So from the Chinese perspective, we surprised them, first of all, by allowing this to happen. And we did it under pressure. So the appearance is either we conspired with Washington to screw the Chinese, or we allowed Washington to screw us under pressure. Therefore, we are a weak state. A weak state that allowed itself to sign on to a treaty that cut off essentially all progressive progressed between quotation marks, advanced or cultivated economic relations with our second biggest partner, the future biggest economy of the world, on the say-so of our closest partner. So we cut off economic relations in any meaningful way with the Chinese, not just free trade, but everything short of free trade, because the telos of economic relations is free trade. You build or you keep it at a minimum level, at which point someone says, well, if it's so small, let's go elsewhere. If there's no progression, right, why would another side invest? And that's the Chinese calculation. We'll get to their calculation in a second. And we did it under great pressure by the United States, indeed explicit threats. Some would even say lèse majesté, some grave disrespect towards our Prime Minister. I'm nonpartisan here, but disrespect, pressure, and we signed. And we keep signing and agreeing even though we keep saying, remove the tariffs, we keep showing up. You know, we're not very good negotiators so far. But it gets worse, because the third point, from a Chinese perspective, now from a Russian perspective, from a perspective of New Delhi, from European capitals, from Tokyo, is with whom were we signing? We were signing with a very, very capricious, in my view, untrustworthy president. With all due respect to my American colleagues, whatever side of the fence you sit on politically, it's not my business. Non sono americano. We signed with a president who was breaking deals by virtue of Twitter or threatening to break them on the day, at the hour by hour, as he or she deems fit. And as a result, very few countries are signing serious deals with the United States. Indeed, they're holding them into process, they're stringing them along, they're walking away as the North Koreans did, or they're hedging their bets and going elsewhere, pivoting to other parts because they say, this is a president, indeed maybe this is a country that is too unstable politically. Good people, brilliant country, brilliant civilization, the Americans, but unstable political leadership, particularly at the executive level. We can't do business. We in Canada are very close to the Americans for reasons obvious. I'm a big admirer. We have deep relations. These are inextricable. But to have signed everything away to this particular president, who on the day after a signature can go and threaten Mexico about closing the border, and continue to do so, completely looking askance at the USMCA document and content, the same thing could happen to us. So 3 points. Killed our relations economically with China, did it under pressure, and did it with an untrustworthy partner. From a Chinese perspective, they say this is a weak state that also may have conspired with the stronger state. Let's either not do business with them, or let's punish them for their weakness. And here we get to the tragic moment. That was a strategic moment. The tragic moment was the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. I don't know the fine lady. I don't invest or deal much with Huawei. I don't buy their products. I'm not much of a technophile. And this is something that was at a low level. This was an arrest of an individual in her private capacity in Vancouver. Very well, she may have committed a crime. I have no idea. And by the way, the literature coming from the United States seemed potentially credible. That's not the point. The point is that in arresting her, we allowed what should have been a tactical moment, the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, to take on a strategic character because of the actions, the mistakes that we made originally in USMCA. In the event, Meng Wanzhou was seen by the Chinese as another Canadian move to conspire with the Americans to screw the Chinese. And we were just essentially abiding by American orders. I'm sure we weren't. It was a micro moment that could have happened at the officer level, almost, at the very tactical level at the Vancouver airport and between the relevant agencies, not all the way to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. They've got too much on their plate. But from the Chinese perspective, it could be seen thus. From the Canadian perspective, we're in big trouble because now we're stuck between these two powers, which is a natural dynamic within this ACRE framework. You can imagine us being stuck between the A and the R, the C and the R, and of course the C and A, Meng Wanzhou. What happened? Well, shortly after her arrest, the American president stated that he fancied he could release her if a trade deal were struck with his new enemy, China. For us, that was an obvious point of release. It was a politicization of the file. Indeed, it suggested what the original motive might have been. She should have been released right away. She should still be released. There's no way we can extradite her to the United States. And yet we might still. At which point we could count ourselves lucky if the Chinese ever speak to us again, because we're dead on the sea front, which is extremely dangerous. The Chinese countered by arresting at least two of our citizens. These are individual tragedies, and also make it impossible for many professional people, and indeed lay people, to go without higher blood pressure, without their blood pressure raised, to China, which is a tragedy. More for us than the Chinese, because we really do need to learn about what's happening there. They've done their study here. What do we do after the arrest? Well, we have no cards left. This is the key point. We've already essentially expressed in law that we're not interested or not allowed otherwise to advance our economic relations with China without the say-so of Washington. So we have no cards to play. That's why a tactical case of arrests has risen to a strategic crisis. Because the strategic cards were taken out of our hands by the Americans, and the Chinese were the first to calculate this. I don't think we in Canada understand what's happened still. We're still struck by the information warfare, the morality play, the noise about good and bad, and the tragedy of the individual Canadians arrested. Tragedy indeed. It's the responsibility of government to help these people and to have avoided these scenarios in the first instance. What did we do to try to release these two or more Canadians who are stuck in Chinese prisons, tragically? Well, we did what we know only to do, which is go back to our comfort zone, the A axis, which we know well, not being comfortable in the C and the R. We have no relations there. We have very poor intelligence, very poor linguistics. We've not invested in the travel. And we went to Washington to save us. Can you help find a way to get the Canadians out of prison in China? This is the professional analog to the schoolyard situation, in which a boy is bullied by two larger bullies, Bob and Bill, and he goes to Bob in order to save himself from Bill. So we went to Washington, the original bully who pressured us, under tariff threat, to sign this terrible clause, which killed our relations with their enemy, not ours, to try to get us out of this conundrum. And if I'm in the Washington situation, I'm crying crocodile tears, because I'm saying, well, come back to daddy. Right? Why would Trump go to bat for us? He was the one who just imposed this treaty clause, or pressured us to, such that we allowed him to impose it on us. And from the Chinese perspective, of course, they say, well, this confirms the logic that we inferred in the original action, which is you go back to Washington and get your marching orders, or get your help from Washington. This is Canada behaving again like a vassal state that is not able to think for itself, which is completely at odds with the population of Canada generally, which is extremely well educated, cultured, good people, but at that level, at that strategic level, unable to think brutally and calculate along what should be a framework that by now is internalized. Let me just take a quick aside here and speak to those who suggest that Article 3210, which is the so-called China clause in the USMCA agreement, does not prohibit Canada from negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And again, I'm not necessarily a proponent of a full-on free trade agreement, but I've calculated, I think, as have the Chinese, probably much faster than I, that in barring us from reaching a level of free trade, we essentially can't go much further than the present, because the Chinese won't invest in the relationship economically. There's no progression to be had, the progression going eventually to free trade agreement. And also the Chinese calculating that Washington won't allow us to go beyond a certain point. Why would they invest in that, knowing Washington's interests? And why would they compromise their own political prestige, the prestige of China, for some sort of approbation, permission from Washington down the road, not from Ottawa, which is not able to maneuver for itself based on the language. So that's a Chinese calculation. I agree with it. I see it completely. We don't yet understand what's happened because we keep having commentators, some analysts, respectable analysts otherwise, who say, well, legally, there's nothing that prohibits us. It's not a legal calculation. It was a strategic move by the Americans. In their diminished state, they still have enough strategic wherewithal to have imposed on us, who were only looking at the A-axis, something that worked from a more capacious and more sophisticated mental map. They boxed us in and essentially minimized our future relations with China, made them hostile, in fact, without us even having realized it. Or, dare I say, if I'm going to be conspiratorial about it, without us really caring much. That the people who were signing and negotiating didn't care that much about the China question. It was all about America. China was an abstraction. But nay, it's not an abstraction. It's close, it's big, and now the Menwanzhou crisis and the mutual arrests, and now the canola cancellation, which is troubling and hurting our farmers, have made it painful and very real indeed. So no, it's rubbish to say that we can still negotiate a free trade agreement. The 3210 is without consequence. Indeed, imagine if we actually ratify this treaty with this terrible clause, what were to happen? Let's just do that thought experiment before I go to my final point about how to exit the crisis. Do the thought experiment. We ratify, and in law we have this clause, 3210, which says that we cannot negotiate a free trade agreement with China without the say-so of Washington. Essentially what it says, right? Can we ever get out of it? What happens when China, a decade or two from now, really becomes the major economy in the world and surpasses the Americans easily? Everyone is pivoting and investing in China, full-on relations, and we're still boxed into essentially a bilateral relationship with a diminished power, still an important power, our most friendly power, which may or may not be friendly on the day, still our closest ally and economic partner. But we can't move. We can't move to C. We may not even be able to move to R, also potentially non-market. Okay? What do we do? Well, imagine the first prime minister who says, well, we must negotiate deep economic relations with China. We're falling behind. We're falling behind in infrastructure, in transport, in communications, in high tech, in science, in agriculture. Our markets are too boxed in. We're not getting good terms with the Americans because they know we're also boxed in. What happens to the prime minister? Well, you're going to have a plurality, if not a majority of the population who are not thinking correctly because they're not on the right mental map about the original genesis of the problem. Who are going to say, we can't because Washington might punish us with a tariff. Washington will say no. And of course, the prime minister won't even go to the point of asking permission. So he or she will be boxed in. The Americans will make it extremely painful for us to get out of that legal box. Indeed, it would have to be a quasi-revolutionary moment. We'll have to brave the pain coming from Washington in order to just diversify meaningfully our relations with the other major power at our border, China. It's not a morality play. It's basic strategy. And we've screwed it up from the start. You know, I'm being politic about a very painful moment. How do we get out of it? Well, go back to the schoolyard analogy. If you're bullied from both sides, Bob and Bill, in this case, Bob and Bill, both Chinese names, so they're bullying us, you have to get respect vis-a-vis both of them. Boom. Not curry favor with one in order to protect yourself from the other, because then you have only respect from one side, if not neither. Boom. Respect from both sides. Establish an equilibrium. Stand on our own 2 feet, and then do business equal to equal with both Washington and both Beijing. Not as a vassal of Washington and not being punished by Beijing. How does this express itself in practical policy and strategy? Well, I'm not a firm believer in the tit for tat because Canada does not have enough weight for the long haul. We should find, of course, painful moments where we can tweak the Americans and tweak the Chinese just so they know we are alive and kicking, that we're not scared of our own shadow as it seems today. But really, there are two key things that need to happen. And in this case, it's counterintuitive. We cannot ratify USMCA. It is the doom of our strategic future. I'm not exaggerating. We cannot ratify USMCA. That is our pushback against the United States. We can use the excuse of tariffs not to ratify, but we should be explicit in saying that 3210 figures into our calculations. We want to have relations with all the major powers at our borders in our own interests, consistent with our own geography. First point, pushback on the Americans. Pushback on the Chinese is counterintuitive. Yeah. If they arrest further, we will arrest too. Yeah. But that can't endure long. Our political leaders, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, where are they in their travels? Stop going to Washington, New York every second week. Get to Beijing fast. You should have been there several times already. You should be there once every 2 or 3 months. It's the way of the world. It's uncomfortable. That's your job. We should have been there, and we should not only solve this tactical problem, but lay out an entire bilateral agenda with China. If it's not free trade, very well. We can solve a host of issues and benefit from one another's societies in plentiful ways. In the Arctic, infrastructure, in science, in business, in communications, in transportation. There should be direct flights between Yellowknife and Beijing, as there should be from Whitehorse in Beijing, Victoria in Shanghai, and so on. A full agenda, and also make it safe for people in both countries to travel to the other countries. Declare that you are interested in that. You're not interested in capricious arrests. And that is our way of opening the artery back to China and getting their respect. Push back on both sides. Right the ship. UNCA is not a must. And let's start thinking a little less narrowly, less linearly along one axis, and much more eclectically. We have a great future.